Okay, so we're starting with the second decade of the Cold War for this lecture, 1950 to 1959. In the previous lecture, post-World War II, we saw a few themes. We saw containment, the Truman Doctrine, and we also, at the end of the decade, saw the expansion of communism into Asia, with China becoming a communist country, and the Soviet Union leveling the playing field with their detonation of their atomic bomb. So now we enter the 1950s, and tensions are a little bit more widespread, and we have the end of the Truman administration and the beginning of the Eisenhower administration. We're going to first start off with the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, and it's the first hot war of the Cold War. So again, we said the Cold War was no direct conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, but there are plenty of wars throughout the Cold War, and those are referred to as hot wars. And this first one happens when the north of Korea, which was communist or wanted to be communist, invades the south of Korea. And you see here in this graphic, they almost take over all of North Korea, but the UN, led by the United States, comes in to try to stop this advance. And this is another example of containment, except for this time it's billed as a UN operation. It gets a little bit dicey when we push back out and get really close to China, and China eventually will become paranoid that we're going to invade China. They cross over into Korea and attack us, and they push us way back beyond the 30th parallel. But eventually we settle on the 38th parallel here, that we cut Korea in half. And this is the stalemate. After 3 years of fighting, nobody gains any land, nobody loses any land, and this border exists even today. It's still the same, the same division. The war is not actually over yet. It's just seen as a truce. And so we have U.S. military personnel, South Korean military personnel on one side, and we have North Korean personnel on the other side. So this is still a scenario that we're dealing with today, and this division and tension still exists. If you've been following the news, you hear all about it. But this war is kind of a war that most Americans don't focus on too much. Actually, the nickname of it was the Forgotten War. So it's, we essentially tied. So we don't tend to hold this up as like, a celebration or a war that we want to like kind of remember in that regard. But it was a brutal war, and it was the first hot war of the Cold War. Another, that's what's happening in foreign affairs in the early part of the 50s. But, close to home, we have the second Red Scare. Now, we talked about the first Red Scare at the end of World War I, and how, with the establishment of the Soviet Union, and, Americans were nervous and started to kind of search for potential threats of communist threats in the United States. Well, China becomes communist, and the Cold War has begun, and those fears are back in the United States. So the second Red Scare actually starts in the 40s under Truman, but in the early 50s, it kind of escalates. We see Joseph McCarthy as the symbol of the Red Scare. I mean, he's kind of viewed as a demagogue, somebody who's using fear for personal gain or to try to, amass more popularity. He actually uses this fear to eventually try to run for president. He had the aspirations to run for president, but he doesn't get that opportunity. He calls people in front of Congress, calls them out as being communists with very little, if any, actual evidence if they're communists. And so he ruins people's lives. He ruins they lose their jobs. They are like blacklisted or seen as like, threats to America. They may have done nothing wrong at all, but he was kind of bullying them so that he would get more press. And he's a senator in the House. You have the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they investigated suspected communists. and call, again, they had house hearings. They would call people up. This photo down here is the Hollywood 10. So 10 writers and directors in Hollywood, which was seen as this like den of communists. They were called ahead in front of HUAC and pleaded the fifth. And ultimately, they were blacklisted. They lost their jobs. They were not able to work in Hollywood anymore as a result of that. So this was happening across the country, this paranoia and hysteria over the fear of communism. What eventually brings it down is McCarthy accuses military commanders or leaders of being communist. And that just seems preposterous. And the military, fights back against him. And eventually it's, a lot of the truth comes out about what he's doing and the fact that he's just making this up as he goes along. Like he had said that he has all these names of people in the government who are suspected communists, but there was nobody on that list. And really he was just wildly naming people at random just to keep in the headlines. So he eventually falls from grace, and there is a lull in the hysteria of the Red Scare. But throughout the decades, there is going to be a fear that there are spies in the United States. And it's not totally unfounded. We do at times find Soviet spies in the United States. We have spies in the Soviet Union. Two of those spies, or thought to be spies, were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, as seen here. Now they look like your everyday run-of-the-mill couple, American couple, the couple next door, and that's kind of what they were seen as for most of their lives. But once these Soviets get the atomic bomb, people are wondering how on earth did they get this information? And so an investigation is brought about, and Ethel's brother is actually arrested and charged with criminal espionage. And so this is what starts this process here. And he turns state's evidence. He basically says, like, I've got the real spies here. If you give me less of a sentence, then I will name them. And he names his sister and her husband as being the two top spies in this ring, that they were responsible for handing over the secrets of the Manhattan Project. And they are put on trial, and the main thing against them is that they are they're in the American Communist Party, and that's it, really. I mean, they don't have any other proof other than like this testimony, and they're eventually found guilty and sentenced to death by electric chair. So this has like undertones or similarities to Sacco and Vanzetti from the 1920s. And so there was a lot of people speaking out against this, saying like, hey, look, this is a repeat. Don't give in to this fear. These people are being tried unjustly. Excuse me. But nonetheless, they were executed. Recent revelations show that once her brother died, there's all this information that came out, and actually information that the courts had withheld at the time that show that Julius probably was definitely guilty and part of this, but Ethel may have been framed. She may have had nothing to do with it or even known about it, but nobody believed them. So this could be again a case of half justice and half injustice as a result of this hysteria. Okay, so the president of the 1950s is Dwight Eisenhower, and he's going to come up with a number of policies to continue this Cold War, attempt to contain communism and prevent nuclear war. And these three policies are actually more along the lines of preventing nuclear war: brinkmanship, MAD, and massive retaliation. So the idea is that whenever the United States and the Soviet Union would come into an encounter, brinkmanship would occur. Basically, you go right to the you don't like have these little skirmishes and whatnot. You go right to like, okay, this is going to be a nuclear war or not. And the next idea would be that, look, if it's going to be a nuclear war, if you fire a missile at us, we are going to have massive retaliation. We're going to launch our entire arsenal at you. And likewise, the other side would do the same thing, which would ensure mutually assured destruction. So here you go. We're going to go right to nuclear war. Are you going to fire or not? If they fire, we're going to launch everything we have. So are they, and it will destroy the entire world. So those are policies, actually. It sounds like it was the worst case scenario, but those policies actually created the tension that prevented nuclear war in a lot of cases. So basically, like, who's going to be crazier is the policies of the Cold War. And they tend to work for the 1950s and 1960s, all the way up through the 80s until it's over. So these policies were put on paper by Eisenhower. Again, Eisenhower is going to try to also contain communism, just like Truman did. He expands the Truman Doctrine, creates the Eisenhower Doctrine. And part of that is going to be that he doesn't have to deal with the expansion of communism in different parts of the world. So, Asia has already had China fall to communism, but this idea of the domino theory. So China falls to communism. Okay, well, now Korea is falling to communism. So this is a domino effect. And then while Eisenhower is president, Vietnam starts to have a communist revolution. So in Asia, it seems like all of these countries in Asia are falling to communism, but this is a domino effect that might lead back to eventually the United States being overtaken by communism. So the domino theory. And so another part of the world that was threatened by communism at the same time was the Middle East. So it seemed like communism was spreading everywhere. And so the Eisenhower Doctrine dealt with these countries in the Middle East, trying to keep the Soviet Union out of the Middle East by giving weapons and money, and in this case, boots on the ground too, advisors. And we're going to do that in Vietnam: money, weapons, and advisors initially under Eisenhower. So, this is the other examples of containment that are expanded with Eisenhower. There is a time period where there's a lull or a thaw in this tension between the US and the Soviet Union, and that is peaceful coexistence. There'll be another time that is détente in the 1970s, another thaw or peaceful relations. Ironically, they both involve Richard Nixon. Nixon, who was vice president under Eisenhower and then will be president when détente comes around. But this was a time period where we shared ideas and policies and actually visited one another. We sent Nixon over to the Soviet Union and Khrushchev came here. And it seemed like the Cold War was going to end, like we were on a good path, but it's only basically for a year. This peace came crashing down because the Soviet Union puts down a revolt in Hungary. There are people who want to overthrow the communist government in Hungary, and it's a brutal takedown of these rebels in Hungary. And so we have to respond. And so, the guard goes up again, and we basically end this peaceful coexistence. But for a brief moment, we saw that maybe we could get along. And then in 1957, to make matters worse, the Soviets best us in the space race. Actually, the space race hasn't technically begun yet, but this starts it for sure when Sputnik is launched. It's a radio satellite. And now, hey, the Soviets have rocket technology that far is superior to ours, and we have to catch up. So as a result, we found NASA in 1958. We fund more math and science. We expand that throughout all the educational system through the United States, which we even see today as the emphasis on math and science at the expense of history, unfortunately. People in the humanities have a hard time with this, but that starts back in 1957 with the launching of Sputnik. Now, people weren't necessarily completely freaked out by Sputnik. They knew it was a radio satellite, but what freaked them out more was that now, does it mean that the Soviets are more technologically advanced? And two, could they put nuclear weapons on these rockets and fire them at us? So this space race begins, and it's part of this fear of what could be. So that's a big event in the 1950s. And just like the 1940s ended in 1949 with some key turns of twists and turns, the 1950s ends with with a major twist in that communism comes to our shores. Cuban Revolution in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Cuba, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara lead a communist revolution, kick out American business and American sympathizers and Cuban elite. They flee to America, and Cuba becomes a communist country, 90 miles away. So now we have to worry about the domino theory in the Caribbean and Latin America. And so we put an embargo on Cuba, and we basically try to stop it. Che Guevara goes around and tries to spread communism through this region, and he's eventually killed. And we start, these countries are ripe for communism. They have been taken advantage of for decades. And so we try to improve our relations and actually send CIA and other people into these countries to try to stop any communist uprising. And eventually the plan, and as Eisenhower is leaving office, is to try to assassinate Fidel Castro and take back Cuba. And that's going to usher us into the next decade, the 1960s, which will be the next lecture. And you can check that out. But for now, we're done with the 1950s.